On October 16, 1793, just past noon, 12:15 to be exact, the blade of the guillotine came crashing down in the center of Paris, bringing a gruesome end to the life of a woman who had once held more power than nearly any other queen in Europe. As her severed head fell into the basket, the crowd let out a savage cheer. Blood pooled on the wooden platform beneath her, a stark red punctuation mark at the end of a royal era that had lasted over 1,000 years. The woman was Marie Antoinette, the Austrian-born princess who became the last queen of France. Her death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a violent, symbolic act, a nation's way of wiping the slate clean. But the guillotine was only the final act in a 76-day-long ordeal filled with psychological torment, public humiliation, and the brutal dismantling of everything she once held dear. From the gold-drenched halls of Versailles to a rat-infested stone cell in the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette's downfall remains one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in all of history. It's not just a cautionary tale about a monarch out of touch with her people. It's a lens into the terrifying birth of the modern political world. The woman who climbed the scaffold that October afternoon didn't look anything like the elegant, feather-crowned queen once seen dancing through Versailles. Her once luxurious hair had been crudely chopped short to bare her neck for the blade. The jeweled hands that used to hold golden scepters and sign royal decrees were tied behind her back with coarse rope. Her transformation was complete. No longer Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. She was now simply prisoner number 280, Widow Capet. Her path to the guillotine didn't begin with a single crime or betrayal. It began with years, decades, of rising anger against a monarchy that had grown tone-deaf to the needs and suffering of its people. Marie Antoinette, born in Vienna and forever seen as an outsider by the French, became the ideal scapegoat for that fury. Her accent, her fashion, her perceived extravagance, all turned her into a symbol of the ruling class's cruelty and ignorance. But beyond the angry mobs and revolutionary propaganda, the truth about Marie Antoinette is far more nuanced. The woman who stood silent at the guillotine was not the shallow villain of gossip and pamphlets. She wasn't a heartless traitor or a clueless snob. She was a mother who had watched her children torn from her arms, a wife who had seen her husband executed just months earlier, and a woman who endured a level of psychological torment that would have broken most people long before they reached the scaffold. France in 1793 was a powder keg, ready to explode. Revolution had turned into paranoia, and paranoia into bloodshed. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, was steering the country through what would come to be known as the Reign of Terror, a period where suspicion alone could earn you a date with the guillotine. In that kind of climate, Marie Antoinette's fate wasn't sealed by facts, but by optics. The revolutionary government needed a win, something dramatic to prove they were in control. And what better symbol to sacrifice than the most hated woman in France? Her trial was a mockery of justice, a show trial, a political performance masquerading as a legal proceeding. The public prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, had already written her death sentence before the trial even began. Most of the evidence against her was fabricated, and witnesses were pressured into telling the story the revolutionaries wanted to hear. And yet, through all of it, she never broke. Even in captivity, even facing death, Marie Antoinette managed to carry herself with a kind of inner calm and strength that unsettled her captors. They expected a hysterical queen clinging to her title. They got a silent, dignified woman staring down her accusers. Her final chapter raises tough questions. about justice, about vengeance, about the cost of political change. When Marie Antoinette died, she didn't just take her last breath. She marked the death of a political system and the bloody birth of a new one. Her story asks, how far should we go for revolution? And at what point does justice turn into cruelty? To understand how she got there, we have to go back. Her journey to the scaffold didn't start with revolution. It started in the glittering world of Versailles, where she was queen for 19 years. Born in 1755 as an Austrian archduchess, Marie Antoinette was raised in the formal, rule-bound court of Empress Maria Theresa. Everything in her world was dictated by etiquette. At just 14, she was married by proxy to the future King Louis XVI, part of a strategic alliance between Austria and France. Two former enemies trying to bury centuries of conflict with a royal marriage. When she arrived in France in 1770, Versailles was a palace unlike any other. More than 3,000 people lived there. Courtiers, servants, noble families, all orbiting the king and queen, all vying for favor. And every move Marie Antoinette made was scrutinized. Every word was analyzed. Every smile had political weight. At Versailles, there was no privacy. She couldn't even get dressed in the morning without a ranked lady of the court assisting her. She never ate alone. Even her most intimate moments were subject to public protocol. It was a gilded cage, and the public had no idea just how confining it was. Meanwhile, outside the palace, France was teetering toward disaster. By the 1780s, the cost of maintaining Versailles was swallowing up nearly half of the country's annual budget. And while peasants starved, the royals held masked balls, gambled, and lived in a fantasy world. Marie Antoinette, who had grown up in luxury and had no concept of poverty, became the public face of that extravagance. Her love of fashion, gambling, and private performances gave her enemies all the ammunition they needed. She was accused of everything from frivolous spending to treason, and her Austrian origins made it easy for the public to believe she was working against France. Even the infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," which there's no record she ever said, became a weapon against her. It captured everything people wanted to believe about the Queen's supposed coldness and disconnect. When she had a smaller retreat built on palace grounds, a rustic-looking peasant village known as the Petit Trianon, it was meant to be a quiet escape from court life. But in the press, it became more proof that she mocked the poor. The irony? The cost of building and maintaining the Petit Trianon was a fraction of what court festivities usually ran, but optics had already turned against her. By the late 1780s, the situation was spiraling. France's support for the American Revolution had drained the treasury. Enlightenment ideas about freedom, equality, and popular sovereignty were spreading fast. But while the people debated new forms of government in salons and cafes, Marie Antoinette was still immersed in court rituals. Seemingly unaware of just how close the storm had grown, she would realize it soon enough. In 1789, King Louis XVI was forced to convene the Estates General for the first time in over 170 years, opening the door to revolutionary change. The Third Estate, the commoners, eventually broke away and declared themselves the National Assembly, asserting that they, not the king, were the true voice of France's Marie Antoinette. Alarmed, urged her husband to use military force to stop them. He hesitated. That hesitation cost them dearly, and later, her advice would be used as evidence that she was a counter-revolutionary. Then came July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille, the tipping point, the moment when citizens proved they could take down a royal stronghold. The queen is said to have told those around her that the monarchy hadn't faced a crisis like this since the wars of religion. She was right, and worse was still to come. As revolutionary flames spread from Paris to the countryside, Marie Antoinette found herself more than just unpopular. She was now being painted as the puppet master behind royal resistance. Public perception turned venomous. Pamphlets and newspapers flooded the streets, portraying her as a scheming seductress, a foreign agent, even a nymphomaniac. These weren't just character attacks. They were dehumanizing. They stripped her of complexity, painting her as a cartoon villain who deserved whatever punishment came next. These publications, called libelles, were often laced with pornographic imagery and wild conspiracies, accusing the queen of everything from incest to espionage. The goal wasn't to inform the public, it was to destroy her image entirely. And it worked. In October 1789, the revolution physically reached Versailles. Thousands of women, furious over bread shortages and inflamed by revolutionary rhetoric, marched from Paris to the palace. They forced their way inside, killing 2 royal guards in a chaotic and brutal scene. Marie Antoinette, reportedly woken in the middle of the night by screams and pounding footsteps, barely escaped with her life. That moment was a turning point. The royal family was forced to move to Paris, into the Tuileries Palace. On paper, they were still monarchs, but in reality, they were prisoners. Every movement was monitored, every letter opened. Guards roamed the halls, their glares a constant reminder of the danger surrounding the family. For the queen, life at the Tuileries was a waking nightmare. There were no court ceremonies, no privacy, just tension and surveillance. Even her attempts to maintain a sense of family normalcy were watched and reported. And with each passing month, the noose of revolution tightened. In June 1791, Marie Antoinette and her family made one last desperate bid for freedom. The plan was simple: escape Paris under cover of night and rendezvous with loyal troops near the border. Disguised as a governess, the queen rode with her children in a heavy, covered carriage. But the plan was fatally flawed. Too elaborate, too slow, too public. They were recognized by a local postmaster in Varennes, arrested, and forced to return to Paris in disgrace. The image of the king and queen brought back under armed guard was a humiliation that shattered whatever legitimacy they had left. After that, everything changed. The people no longer saw them as misguided rulers. They saw them as enemies of the revolution, and Marie Antoinette, who had helped organize the escape, became the face of treason. Her secret letters to foreign monarchs, including her brother, the Emperor of Austria, were discovered, revealing her attempts to rally military support against the revolution. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia, and the Queen's connection to the enemy turned her into a lightning rod for blame. Every battlefield loss was pinned on her. She was accused of leaking strategies, sabotaging the army, undermining the nation from within. It didn't matter whether the accusations were true. The court of public opinion had already made its decision. On August 10, 1792, the monarchy officially collapsed. The royal family was arrested again, this time taken to the Temple, a dark, medieval fortress in the heart of Paris. There, they would live not as disgraced nobles, but as state prisoners. The Temple was no ordinary prison. It was originally built by the Knights Templar in the 12th century, but now it served a far darker purpose. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, damp, suffocating rooms. For Marie Antoinette, who had spent most of her life in gold-lined chambers, it was a psychological shock. She was crammed into a 4-room tower suite with Louis the Master, their 2 surviving children, Marie-Thérèse and Louis-Charles, and the king's sister, Madame Elizabeth. The space was small, cold, and constantly watched by guards. There was no luxury, no comfort, just rigid routines and constant humiliation. The guards woke them each morning at 7 o'clock, ransacking their rooms in search of contraband or escape plans. Meals were bland and served on plain earthenware. Even their clothes were regulated. Marie Antoinette was forbidden to wear anything that resembled royalty. But the worst part wasn't the discomfort. It was the slow, calculated dismantling of their family. Revolutionaries worked methodically to separate the royals from each other, physically and emotionally. The children were a particular target. Young Louis Charles, only 7, was subjected to non-stop propaganda. Guards told him his parents were traitors, that the revolution was his new family, that his bloodline was a stain on France. They hoped to remake him into a symbol of the new order, a clean slate free of royal corruption. Marie Antoinette tried to shield him. She created stories and games, held impromptu lessons, and did everything she could to preserve some sense of childhood for her kids. She taught her daughter reading, writing, languages, anything to maintain a shred of normalcy. But the walls were closing in. The outside world had all but vanished. The family was cut off from supporters, allies, and hope. News came only in fragments. Whispers from guards, censored letters, glimpses of headlines. Marie Antoinette, once the most connected woman in Europe, now had to rely on scraps of gossip to understand her fate. And then, in January 1793, came the final blow. King Louis XVI was put on trial for treason and executed by guillotine on January 21st. Marie Antoinette heard the cannon fire from her cell and knew what it meant. Her husband was gone. Her children were now orphans, and she alone was next. The queen's condition deteriorated quickly. Her hair turned gray. She suffered from extreme fatigue, headaches, irregular bleeding, and deep depression. Guards dismissed her symptoms as hysteria, but modern scholars believe she was experiencing the physical toll of profound trauma and malnutrition. Still, she refused to break. But the revolution was far from finished with her. On August 1st, 1793, in the dead of night, guards entered her room and told her she was being transferred. There was no warning, no time for goodbyes. Her children remained behind, asleep in their beds. She was allowed only one last glance at their windows before being led away into the darkness. Her destination? The conciergerie. If the temple was prison, the conciergerie was purgatory. Located on the Île de la Cité in central Paris, it was attached to the Palace of Justice and served as the last stop before execution for hundreds during the Reign of Terror. It was infamous even then. The conditions were appalling. Marie Antoinette's new cell was just 12 feet by 8, barely large enough for a mattress, a table, and a chair. A folding screen offered minimal privacy from guards who monitored her constantly, recording her every move and word. The walls dripped with moisture. The air was thick with mold, and the smell of human waste and rot was inescapable. For a woman who had once walked on Persian carpets and dined from gold dishes, the conciergerie was a living nightmare. She was stripped of her name, now addressed simply as Widow Capet, a title that erased any trace of royalty and emphasized her fall. Meals consisted of black bread and watery soup. Books were forbidden. Letters were censored or blocked altogether. Day after day, she sat in silence, surrounded by filth and fear. But her spirit never entirely cracked. even as her health failed, even as her children were torn from her, even as the walls of her world closed in. Marie Antoinette clung to the one thing no revolution could take: her dignity. By the time her trial began in October 1793, Marie Antoinette was a shell of the woman she had once been. But she was still standing. Her trial wasn't really about guilt or innocence. It was theater, a performance staged by the revolutionaries to publicly destroy the last trace of monarchy. Her accusers didn't just want a conviction, they wanted humiliation. She was charged with depleting the national treasury, conspiring with foreign powers, and most scandalously, with incest, an accusation involving her own son, Louis Charles. The courtroom gasped. Even the public prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, looked briefly uneasy. But the Queen, stunned, refused to give them the emotional outburst they were hoping for. Instead, she responded with silence. Then, in a calm but powerful voice, she denied the charge. Not for herself, but for the sake of motherhood. "If I have not answered," she finally said, "it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge brought against a mother." That moment of quiet strength reportedly brought murmurs of sympathy even from hostile spectators. But it wasn't enough to change the outcome. The trial lasted just 2 days. She was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death. There was no opportunity to see her children again. No final letters allowed to leave her cell uncensored. Only hours left to live, and she spent them in quiet reflection. On the morning of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was awakened at dawn. Unlike her husband, who had been allowed to ride to the scaffold in a closed carriage, she was loaded onto a rickety open cart and paraded through the streets of Paris for over an hour. She wore a simple white dress, now stained and yellowed from months in prison. Her once voluminous hair had been crudely chopped short. On her feet, basic shoes. No crown, no jewels, no symbols of rank. Just a widow riding toward her death. As the cart passed the crowds, people screamed insults. Some threw rotten vegetables. Others stood in silence, unsure of how to feel. What struck many was not her brokenness, but her composure. She kept her back straight. She looked ahead. And when she arrived at the scaffold, she climbed the steps without assistance. There's a small, almost forgotten moment from that day. As she was being positioned under the guillotine, Marie Antoinette accidentally stepped on the foot of her executioner. Immediately, she apologized. "Pardon me, sir. I didn't do it on purpose." Those words, spoken in the final seconds of her life, were not the words of a queen or a criminal. They were the words of a human being trying to hold on to the last remnants of grace. At 12:15 p.m., the blade fell. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others wept. And in the silence that followed, the old world was truly gone. Marie Antoinette's story didn't end with her death. In fact, the myths and debates surrounding her only deepened. For some, she remains the frivolous, out-of-touch monarch who symbolized everything wrong with the Ancien regime. For others, she is a tragic figure, caught in a historical tidal wave she couldn't stop. But beyond the politics and propaganda, her final days tell us something deeper. They reveal the human cost of revolution, the thin line between justice and revenge, and the incredible capacity for dignity under unbearable pressure. She wasn't perfect. She made mistakes, big ones. She lived in luxury while others starved. She misread the mood of her people. She underestimated the revolution. But she also loved fiercely. She protected her children. She stayed composed in the face of unimaginable loss. and she died with her head held high. History tends to simplify. It needs heroes and villains. But real people are more complicated. Marie Antoinette was not the heartless tyrant of revolutionary pamphlets, nor was she a saint. She was a queen, a mother, a woman, and in her last moments, perhaps more than ever before, she was simply human. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when symbols matter more than truth? What do we lose when vengeance replaces justice? And what does it really mean to die with dignity? Over 230 years later, Marie Antoinette's life and death continue to echo. Not because she was flawless, but because she was flawed in ways we recognize, in ways that still matter. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we still remember her.